3 days before my wedding, my ex-girlfriend sent me one word. I didn't answer. I wish to God I had. I remember staring at the screen for almost a full minute, my thumb hovering over the message, telling myself it didn't matter anymore, that whatever Whitney had to say belonged to a version of my life I had already closed the door on. I put the phone face down on the counter and went back to folding napkins for the reception, because that felt like the responsible thing to do, the mature thing to do. I had no idea that single word she sent me would end up being the only warning I was ever going to get, and that by the time I understood what it meant, it would already be too late to do anything about it. The morning of the wedding, the venue looked exactly the way Emily and I had planned it for 11 months. White chairs in perfect rows, string lights looped between the trees, her grandmother's veil pressed and hanging in the back room where she was getting ready. I remember standing at the altar in my rented shoes, watching the last few guests find their seats, feeling the kind of calm that only comes from believing you have already survived the hardest part of loving someone. I did not know, standing there, that somewhere in the parking lot a taxi was idling with its engine running, or that inside that venue a decision was already being made that had nothing to do with cold feet, and everything to do with something I had been too comfortable to notice. By the end of the day, that altar would be empty. The bouquet Emily had chosen herself, white ranunculus and eucalyptus, would be lying face down in the grass instead of in her hands. And the ring I had saved for 2 years to afford would be sitting alone on a table, catching the afternoon light with no one left to put it on. I'm going to walk you through every part of how we got there, from the very first time Whitney tried to warn me, to the exact moment Emily found out the truth, to the conversation months later that changed how I understood this entire story. By the end of this, you are going to have to ask yourself something uncomfortable. Would you have seen it coming, or would you have missed it exactly the way I did? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Emily left that day, you cannot start with the wedding. You have to start almost 4 years earlier, back when the only two women in the story had never even heard each other's names, back before Whitney was an ex-girlfriend and Emily was anyone to me at all. There is a version of this story where none of it happens, where the wedding goes exactly the way it was supposed to, where I marry Emily without incident and this video never gets made. But that is not what happened. What happened started quietly with a friendship I convinced myself was harmless, a warning I convinced myself was nothing, and a woman standing at an altar who deserved to know the truth long before she found it out on her own wedding day. There were three people at the center of this. There was Emily, the woman I had built a life with, steady and trusting in a way I did not always deserve. There was Whitney, the woman I had loved before her, who saw something the rest of us refused to look at directly. And there was me, standing in between both of them, telling myself I was protecting everyone by saying nothing at all. What none of us understood yet was that silence was never actually protecting anyone. It was only delaying the moment when all three of us would have to face what was true, and that moment was coming whether I was ready for it or not. I met Whitney when I was 26 years old, working a job I did not love yet, in a city that still felt too big for me. She was the kind of person who noticed things other people walked right past, the way a room went quiet when someone was upset, the way a joke could cover up something real underneath it. We were together for almost 3 years, and for most of that time I believed we were building something permanent. Looking back now, I think what we actually had was two people who understood each other completely but wanted different things from a future together. When it ended, it did not end with anger. It ended with both of us agreeing, quietly and sadly, that we loved each other in a way that was not enough to build a marriage on. I did not know then how much that history would matter later. Emily came into my life almost a year after Whitney and I had already gone our separate ways. She worked 2 floors above me, and the first real conversation we had was in an elevator that got stuck for 11 minutes, which she still brings up whenever she wants to remind me how our whole relationship almost started with both of us sweating in a metal box. Emily was steady in a way I had never experienced before. She made decisions with her whole chest, she trusted people until they gave her a reason not to, and she loved without keeping score. Within a year I knew I wanted to marry her, and within 2 years I had a ring hidden in the back of my sock drawer, waiting for the right moment to ask. What I never told Emily, not fully, was that Whitney and I had stayed loosely in touch. Nothing dramatic, nothing either of us would have called wrong at the time. An occasional message checking in, a mutual friend's wedding where we ended up at the same table, a birthday text once a year that I told myself meant nothing because it had always meant nothing before. I convinced myself that keeping this quiet was not the same as hiding it. I told myself Emily did not need to know about a friendship that lived so far in the past, because bringing it up would only create a problem where one did not exist. I understand now how wrong that reasoning was, but at the time, it felt harmless. It felt like nothing worth mentioning at all. The first time I noticed something had shifted in Whitney was almost 8 months before the wedding. Emily and I had just posted our engagement photos, the two of us laughing on a beach at sunset, her ring catching the light in almost every frame. Whitney did not comment on the post the way our other friends did. She did not send the usual congratulations message either. Instead, 3 days later, she sent me a single line that I read twice and then chose to ignore completely. It said, "Are you sure about this?" I remember feeling a flash of irritation more than anything else, the kind of irritation you feel when someone brings up a question you have already decided not to think about. I told myself she was struggling to see me move on. I did not consider, even for a second, that she might be trying to protect me from something I could not see yet myself. Emily, for her part, sensed something long before I ever admitted it to myself. She never asked about Whitney directly, not in those early months, but she would go quiet sometimes when my phone lit up at an unusual hour. She would change the subject when older photos surfaced on social media, tagged with names from a version of my life she had never been part of. I told myself her silence meant it was not a big deal to her. I understand now that her silence meant something closer to the opposite. Emily was the kind of person who waited to gather the full picture before she reacted to anything. She was patient in a way that looked, from the outside, like nothing was wrong at all. That patience was about to be tested more than either of us could have predicted. By the time wedding planning was in full swing, life felt on the surface exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Venue booked, dress altered, invitations sent to nearly 200 people who loved us. Emily and I spent our evenings choosing centerpieces and arguing gently over the seating chart, the kind of small, ordinary friction that makes a life together feel real. And underneath all of it, quietly, almost invisibly, Whitney's question from 8 months earlier was still sitting somewhere in the back of my mind, unanswered and unexamined. I had filed it away as nothing. I did not yet understand that some questions do not disappear just because you refuse to look at them. Some questions simply wait for the moment you are least prepared to face them. That moment was closer than any of us realized. 6 weeks before the wedding, Whitney reached out again, and this time it was harder to convince myself it meant nothing. It was not a comment or a like or a passing message buried in a group chat. It was a direct call, one I let go to voicemail because Emily and I were in the middle of a tasting appointment, sampling 3 kinds of cake under fluorescent lights that made everything taste slightly too sweet. I listened to the voicemail later that night in the car, alone, engine off, driveway dark. Whitney's voice sounded different than I remembered it. Careful, measured. She said she needed to tell me something before the wedding happened, something she should have said months earlier. She asked me to call her back when I had time to actually talk. I did not call her back that night. I told myself I would once things calmed down. Things did not calm down. The weeks that followed were consumed by everything a wedding demands of two exhausted people trying to hold full-time jobs at the same time. Final dress fittings, seating chart revisions, a rehearsal dinner venue that canceled with almost no warning, forcing us to scramble for a replacement. Every night I told myself I would call Whitney back tomorrow, and every tomorrow arrived carrying its own emergency that felt more urgent than a conversation I had already decided was probably nothing important. I want to be honest about something here. Some part of me did not want to know what she was going to say. It is easier in the moment to protect a wedding date than to protect the truth. I understand that now. I did not understand it then. Emily noticed the voicemail before I ever told her about it, which is something I did not learn until much later. She had picked up my phone one afternoon to check the weather for the rehearsal dinner, and Whitney's name sat there on the screen, unanswered, time-stamped from nearly 2 weeks earlier. She did not confront me about it. She did not even mention it that day. Emily kept a mental record of things quietly, the way some people keep receipts in a drawer they never look through until they need to prove something to themselves. She told me afterward that seeing that name did not scare her right away. What scared her was realizing slowly that I had chosen not to mention it either. A missed call is nothing. A missed call you hide from your fiancé becomes something else entirely. 4 days before the wedding, Whitney tried one more time, and this attempt was impossible to misread the way the others had been. She sent a message that read simply, "Please call me. It's about the wedding, not about us." I remember reading those 7 words standing in the kitchen of the apartment Emily and I shared, surrounded by moving boxes we had already half packed for our new place after the honeymoon. For the first time, the irritation I usually felt toward Whitney's messages was replaced by something closer to unease. If this was not about the two of us, what could it possibly be about the wedding itself? I typed a reply 3 separate times and deleted it 3 separate times, unsure what I was even afraid of hearing. I never sent that reply. 3 days before the wedding, exactly as I told you at the very beginning, Whitney sent me one final word, just one. It said, "Please." No explanation, no context, just a single word sitting alone on my screen carrying more weight than an entire paragraph could have carried. I put the phone face down on the counter the same way I had done every time before and told myself that whatever this was, it could wait until after the wedding. I had convinced myself completely that 3 more days of silence would not matter. I had no way of knowing that those 3 days were the only window I was ever going to get. What I did not know, standing in that kitchen with my phone face down and my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit, was that Emily had begun quietly putting pieces together on her own. She had seen enough. The missed call, the unanswered messages, the way my jaw tightened slightly every time Whitney's name appeared on my screen. Emily was not the kind of person who needed a confession to understand that something was being kept from her. She had already started asking herself a question I had not yet found the courage to ask myself, not whether Whitney was trying to reach me, but why I was so determined not to listen. The rehearsal dinner happened 2 nights before the wedding, in a private room at a restaurant Emily had chosen months earlier because the lighting reminded her of the place we had our first real date. Everyone we loved was there. My parents, her parents, old friends who had watched us build this relationship one small decision at a time. I remember standing up to give a toast, holding a glass of wine I barely touched, telling a room full of people how certain I was about the woman sitting beside me. Emily smiled the whole way through it, the way she always did in front of a crowd. It was only later that night, back at the apartment, that I noticed she had gone quiet in a way I recognized but chose not to name. I told myself it was wedding nerves. I did not yet understand what she already knew. The next morning, the day before the wedding, Emily asked me directly for the first time. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat across from me at the kitchen table, phone face down beside her own coffee cup, and asked who Whitney was to me now, and why her name kept appearing on my phone in the weeks leading up to our wedding. I remember the specific stillness of that moment, the sound of the refrigerator humming, the fact that I had rehearsed a version of this conversation in my head 100 times and still had no idea how to actually have it. I told her the truth, or at least most of it. I told her Whitney was someone from before, someone who had tried to reach out, someone I had ignored because I did not think it mattered. Emily asked one more question. She asked what Whitney had actually said. That is when I finally opened the message I had been avoiding for 3 days. Standing in our kitchen the day before my own wedding, with Emily watching my face instead of the screen, I read Whitney's full message out loud for the first time. It was not what either of us expected. Whitney was not trying to win me back. She had heard, through a mutual friend, something about my father's declining health that neither Emily nor I had been told directly, a detail our families had been quietly sitting on to avoid disrupting wedding week. Whitney had been trying, in her own complicated way, to make sure I knew before I stood at that altar and made promises I might regret not fully understanding. The single word, please, had never been about her feelings for me. It had been about something far more urgent that I had spent 3 days refusing to hear. Emily sat with that information longer than I expected her to. I remember watching her face change, not with relief that it was not what she feared, but with something heavier. She told me later that in that moment, the specific content of the message almost stopped mattering to her. What mattered was watching me choose, 3 separate times, to ignore someone who was clearly trying to protect me, simply because acknowledging her existence felt inconvenient during wedding week. Emily said she realized, sitting at that table, that I had done the exact same thing to her in smaller ways throughout our entire relationship. Avoided hard conversations, delayed uncomfortable truths, told myself that silence was kindness when really it was only ever convenience wearing kindness as a disguise. The wedding day arrived exactly as planned on the calendar, but nothing about it unfolded the way either of us had imagined for the past year. Guests arrived in their best clothes, unaware that anything had shifted. The string lights were hung exactly the way we had chosen them. My mother cried happy tears while helping me with my tie, not yet knowing what had happened at that kitchen table less than 24 hours earlier. I stood at the altar in my rented shoes, the same calm I had felt weeks earlier now replaced by something closer to dread, watching the aisle for a woman I was no longer certain would walk down it. She did not yell that day. She did not cause a scene in front of 200 guests who had traveled to watch us make promises to each other. She simply did not come out of the back room at all. I found out from her sister, who walked toward me with an expression I will never forget, holding nothing in her hands but the truth. Emily had already left through the side entrance 20 minutes earlier, her dress still hanging in the back room, the veil her grandmother wore folded gently over a chair. She had taken nothing with her except the ring, which she left behind on the table where her bouquet should have been. I stood at that altar in front of everyone we loved, and I understood fully and completely for the first time that this had never really been about Whitney at all. It had been about every quiet moment I had chosen silence over honesty, and Emily had simply decided on the one day she could not unnotice it that she deserved better than that. There is no version of standing alone at an altar in front of 200 people that feels anything less than humiliating, no matter how much you tell yourself you understand why it happened. I remember someone turning off the string quartet mid-song, the sudden silence louder than the music had been. I remember my mother's hand on my back, steady in a way that told me she already knew more than I did. I remember walking down that same aisle alone, past faces that did not know whether to look at me with pity or confusion, past a wedding cake that would never be cut, past centerpieces Emily and I had argued gently over for weeks. Nobody clapped. Nobody knew what to say. The only sound was 200 folding chairs creaking as people slowly stood up, unsure whether the day was actually over. The next 72 hours are still difficult for me to fully put into words even now. Vendors had to be called and apologized to. Gifts had to be quietly returned, some of them still sitting unopened in boxes labeled with names of people who would later ask, gently, what had happened. My father, whose declining health had somehow become the invisible center of this entire story, sat me down and told me something I have not forgotten since. He said he understood why Whitney had reached out and he was not angry that she had. What upset him, he said, was watching me choose comfort over truth in almost every part of my life, not just this one. Hearing that from him, so soon after everything else, made the entire wedding week feel less like an isolated failure and more like a pattern I had never bothered to examine. Whitney called me 4 days after the wedding was supposed to happen, and this time I answered on the first ring. Her voice sounded exhausted, not triumphant, not vindicated, simply tired in a way that told me she had spent those 4 days replaying her own choices as many times as I had replayed mine. She told me she had almost decided not to say anything at all, worried it would look exactly like what some people were now assuming, an ex-girlfriend trying to disrupt a wedding out of old feelings that never fully went away. She told me she went back and forth on it for weeks before finally sending that first message 8 months earlier, terrified of being misunderstood, terrified of staying silent, and finding out later that her silence had cost me something I could never get back. I asked her directly whether any part of this had been about wanting me back, and I want to be honest about how long she took before answering. She admitted that somewhere underneath the concern for my father, there had been a smaller, quieter feeling she had not fully untangled from the rest of it, a feeling she was not proud of and had tried hard not to act on. She said that was exactly why she had waited so long to reach out, and why the messages had been so careful, so vague, so easy for me to misread or ignore entirely. Hearing her say that out loud did not make me angry. It made the entire situation feel more human, messier, and more complicated than a simple story about a warning nobody listened to. Emily, meanwhile, had gone quiet in a different way. She was staying with her sister, not answering calls from me or from anyone connected to the wedding, giving herself the space she said she needed to figure out what she actually believed about the last 2 years of her life. Mutual friends told me she was not angry in the way people expected. She was not telling a story where she was simply the victim of a scheming ex-girlfriend, because she understood, more clearly than most people around her, that this had never really been Whitney's failure to manage. It had been mine. Emily told her sister she needed time to decide whether the man she had built a wedding around was the same man she wanted to build an actual marriage with, once every convenient silence had already been exposed. 3 weeks after the wedding day that never finished, Emily agreed to see me for the first time. She chose a public place, a coffee shop neither of us had ever been to together, somewhere without any memories attached to it yet. I remember sitting across from her, aware for the first time in a long time that I did not know what she was going to say, and aware, even more uncomfortably, that I finally deserved to sit with that uncertainty instead of controlling it. She did not bring up Whitney at all in that conversation. She asked me one question instead, quietly, without any anger in her voice. She asked why I had always assumed that protecting her meant deciding on my own what she was allowed to know. I did not have an answer ready for Emily's question, and sitting across from her in that coffee shop, I understood that the silence stretching between us was the same silence I had been choosing for months without ever nomming it. Before I could say anything, Emily reached into her bag and set her own phone on the table, screen facing me. She told me there was something I needed to see, something she had been carrying alone since almost 4 months before the wedding, something she had decided not to mention because she assumed it would only cause unnecessary conflict right before the biggest day of our lives. I looked down at the screen, and I felt something shift in my chest before I had even finished reading the first line. It was a message from Whitney, not to me, to Emily, sent 4 months earlier, careful and brief, asking simply whether Emily had noticed me pulling away from hard conversations lately, whether she had noticed a pattern of things going unsaid until they became unavoidable. Emily told me she had read that message the same way I had read Whitney's messages to me, with irritation first, then dismissal, assuming it was some remnant of old feelings dressed up as concern. She had decided not to mention it to me at all, worried it would create exactly the kind of tension we were both trying to avoid during wedding planning. The signal, it turned out, had never gone to just one of us. It had gone to both of us at almost the same time, and we had both chosen the exact same response. Sitting there, I finally understood what Whitney had actually been trying to do all along. She had not been trying to reach me specifically because of old feelings, and she had not been trying to reach Emily out of jealousy either. She had genuinely noticed something the rest of us were too close to see, a pattern of avoidance that had quietly shaped nearly every difficult moment in my adult relationships. One she recognized clearly because she had lived on the other side of it herself years earlier, before either of us understood what was actually ending our own relationship. She had tried to name it gently, first to me, then to Emily, hoping one of us would take it seriously enough to act on it before the wedding made avoidance permanent instead of temporary. Emily told me in that coffee shop that the hardest part of the last 3 weeks had not been the humiliation of the wedding day itself. It had been realizing that she had ignored the same warning I had ignored, for the exact same reason, out of a desire to protect a day on the calendar instead of protecting the truth underneath it. She said she had spent those 3 weeks asking herself a harder question than whether I could be trusted. She had been asking whether she had been complicit in building a relationship on convenient silence, simply because confronting the pattern earlier would have meant facing the possibility that our entire foundation needed more honesty than either of us had been willing to offer it. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it was not the reconciliation moment people often expect from stories like this one. Emily did not forgive me that day in the coffee shop, and I did not ask her to. What we did instead was agree quietly and carefully to have the conversation neither of us had been willing to have for the better part of a year, about what honesty actually required from both of us, not just from me. We talked for almost 3 hours, past the point where the coffee shop staff began stacking chairs around us, past the point where either of us had a clear sense of where the conversation would ultimately lead. For the first time since the wedding fell apart, neither of us was trying to protect the other person from an uncomfortable truth. It has been almost a year since that afternoon in the coffee shop, and I want to tell you honestly that this is not a story that ends with a second wedding, at least not yet. Emily and I are still together, but we rebuilt things slowly in a way that looked nothing like the relationship we had before. We started seeing a counselor within a month of that conversation, not because anything was broken beyond repair, but because we both agreed we did not trust ourselves to identify convenient silence on our own anymore. My father's health, the very thing Whitney had been trying to warn me about, stabilized enough over the following months that we were given more time with him than any of us expected on that difficult wedding week. I no longer take that time for granted the way I once might have. Whitney and I do not speak often now, but the last time we did, she told me something I think about more than almost anything else from this entire story. She said she used to believe that saying nothing was the safest choice available to her, the option least likely to hurt anyone, including herself. She told me that watching how everything unfolded had changed her mind completely. She said silence had never actually protected anyone in this story. It had only delayed the moment when the truth arrived anyway, on a day when it did the most possible damage instead of the least. I think about that conversation often, especially on the days when staying quiet still feels like the easier choice. Emily and I did eventually get married quietly almost 8 months after that coffee shop conversation, in a small ceremony with only our immediate families present. There was no string quartet, no 200 guests, no rented shoes pinching my feet while I waited at an altar. Just the two of us choosing each other again with far more honesty than either of us had brought to the relationship the first time around. She kept the same ring. She told me it had never been the ring that was ever the problem. So I will leave you with the same question I promised you at the very beginning of this story. Would you have seen it coming? Would you have opened that message the first time it arrived, or would you have told yourself, the way I did, that it could wait until tomorrow? I think most of us like to believe we would have acted differently, that we would have listened the moment someone tried to warn us. But the truth is, warnings rarely arrive announcing themselves clearly. Most of the time, they arrive quietly, easy to dismiss, easy to postpone, easy to convince yourself does not matter yet. It is only afterward, looking back, that the signal becomes impossible to miss. I want to know what you would have done in my position, or in Emily's, or even in Whitney's. Would you have sent that message earlier? Would you have opened it sooner? Or would you have stayed silent the same way all three of us did for far too long? Let me know in the comments below where you are watching this from. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if this story affected you the way it affected all of us living through it, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because there are more true stories like this one still to come, and you will not want to miss what happens next.